From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. In First Today from the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. He'll share his current view of the world coarse grain markets and how well the U.S. is positioned to compete successfully in those markets. Then, on the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk, Todd Barrows of the Farm Service Agency will provide an update on the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. He'll cover several common questions that producers are raising as they apply for those CFAP payments. Further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee looks at the possibility of using tilapia instead of grass carp for cleaning up unwanted vegetation in farm ponds, including blue-green algae. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along with us once more. Well, this is our first opportunity to have a conversation with the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, and he's offering regularly perspectives on the global grain markets. And in fact, he recently made a presentation to the U.S. Grains Council on the coarse grain markets. Guy Allen with us for the first time in the broadcast. Welcome to you, Guy. And you've been mostly in the private sector before coming to K-State, you say.
Yes, thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here today. Yes, I'm just originally a farm boy from central Illinois. Grew up on a grain and livestock farm, corn, beans, a little bit of wheat, and cattle, and a few pigs. But for the last 35 years or so, I've been in the commercial grain trade, 28 of which I've been overseas. So I just recently came back to the U.S. to assume this position and becoming domesticated back into the U.S. Last 28 years, I've spent time primarily in Australia, but also in China, Southeast Asia, working as a commodity trader, importing, exporting, all the way from post-farm gate, country elevator, country merchant, to the international commodity trade, and then consulting and engaging a lot of end users and first-stage processing around the world.
So you bring a rich background from the industry to this position. The macroeconomic issues driving the international grain trades, they are plenty and they are diverse, you say.
Yeah, I don't know I've ever seen a time in the last 30 years where we've had such a range of diverse macroeconomics issues driving things. But just to highlight the list, at the moment, this global recession, the impact of the COVID-19 virus, not only in the U.S. but globally, we're into a situation of declining economic activity. That's reduced per capita income, reduced disposable income, and it's really seeing a shift in the demand across food and agricultural products. And we're really not quite sure how to quantify that. We know it's changing quite significantly, particularly evident in the meat sector, but the net of a result of that is a bit of question. Underlying that, we still have this African swine fever situation, predominantly in China as well as Southeast Asia, which is impacting the meat sector. One thing the U.S. producer doesn't think a lot of is the strength of the U.S. dollar, and that's having a significant impact the last 3 years on the competitiveness of U.S. commodities into the export market. Also, the geopolitical tensions in renegotiating trade agreements, the trade issues with China, UK coming on, and it's just a real quagmire of issues out there to navigate at the moment.
Well, because you shared information expressly on the coarse grains with the U.S. Grains Council recently, we want to focus on that in our conversation today. And one thing that you note right out, Guy, is that we've record production building up out there.
Yeah, look, the USDA and WASDE report still projecting record U.S. corn crop. And we're not only seeing a record corn crop in the U.S., but record coarse grains production internationally around the world. We're seeing sorghum up from last year, and so we're going to be struggling to find a home for all this production we've got in the coming year. The net result, we're going to see increased carryover stocks. at the end of the season.
What does this say about the ability of the U.S. to compete in this arena then? It's going to be a tough battle, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's going to be very, very competitive. As I said, the strength in the U.S. dollar is struggling there as a lot of our customers are seeing a weak currency as well, making U.S. commodities very, very expensive. The other thing I think it's important to realize, and people tend to forget this, is particularly with corn and to a lesser extent wheat, the U.S. is the residual storer of grain. If there's excess surplus to be carried in the free market, we do that. That said, we're seeing changing government policies in countries like India, China, some of the European countries, Russia and the Ukraine particularly, to increase their government-held stocks and inventory as food security becomes an increasing concern around the world. China potentially is going to hold 50% of the carryover stocks within China itself.
Let's dig a little deeper into those big players, if you will, the buyers. China obviously is the headliner there. So what's the outlook as you see it right now?
Well, even though we have record production, we're also going to see record consumption in the coming year. And look, the underlying driver of that is really animal agriculture and the demand for animal protein. So that's a big bright spot, and we're particularly seeing that in the developing countries, China, Southeast Asia, India, and other places, as they want to continue to improve the diet. Even in this time of decreased disposable income and a bit of economic hardship, people have to eat, and they tend to spend their dollar on maybe quality food. Look, China is going to be a bit of a challenge, but we continue to be optimistic that they're going to live up to their commitments in the Phase 1 trade deal. USDA projections for not only the completion of the current marketing year, but for next year has China imports across all the coarse grains going up to about just under 18 million metric tons, which is quite optimistic. Sorghum has been the very bright spot in that situation, as we've seen renewed buying on the sorghum situation, but barley and corn are also make up a big component of that.
Of course, the question then is, can the U.S. capture a significant part of that share?
Yeah. Well, look, it's the Chinese are very shrewd merchandisers and buyers. They very much buy least cost, and so we're going to have to be competitive in the global marketplace. And we're looking at our competitors, particularly in South America, Brazil and Argentina, having very large corn crops as well. Argentina's maybe down a little bit, but we're going to have to be price competitive with the rest of the market. The other, I guess, a newer competitor or renewed competitor is the corn situation in the EU, as they're looking for a very big corn crop in the EU. They're actually looking to increase their exports slightly, and they'll be exporting about 4 to 4.5 million metric tons in the coming year. On the flip side of that, the EU is also a very big importer of grain. They'll import about 21 million metric tons of corn this season, and that should increase up to 23. Interesting thing with the EU, with the wheat corn spread that we're also seeing here in the U.S., wheat is pricing itself out of the feed ration as tightness of quality milling wheat is putting majority of that commodity into the flour millers and human food consumption.
But as you speak of the EU, it doesn't seem to make the big splash that, say, China does when you bring these things up in common conversation. But you think that's a market that's potentially worth pursuing more aggressively? Yeah,
definitely. Particularly, China sort of makes the headlines, but the EU is fairly important. And there's a lot of changes going on with the EU, particularly in the wake of the UK Brexit situation, some restructuring within that. And the EU has a lot of challenges sitting in front of them that they need to address, and that's going to be very much a dynamic marketplace as the situation changes. So we just need to stay very, very close to that. And again, it's being driven by the demand for meat and animal agriculture products.
And you mentioned, Guy, that the EU is also an exporter of note, but it's always important to keep an eye on the competition and who's out there to go up against in this coarse grain market globally. And the other names that pop to the surface there are?
The other exporters that we're going to need to compete with this year are going to be Argentina. Their corn exports are actually projected to be down about 2 million tons. They've got increased competition and a bit of a smaller crop size. Russia and the Ukraine will continue to increase their presence there. They're dominant in the wheat situation, being the largest wheat exporter for the last few years. Sort of looking very down under, where I spent quite a bit of time the last 28 years, is Australia. They've had 3 years of significant drought, significantly impacting their agricultural sector, both in grain and livestock, but they're recovering this year with a very, very good start to the season. Barley's an interesting case where they're going to have production back up to 10.5 million metric tons. About two-thirds of that will be exported, China buying 80% of that. But last month, China whacked an 80% import tariff on Australia barley. It's a good example of how the geopolitical issues and China's capacity to put tariffs and trade barriers in place for reasons outside of the agricultural sector, but more of the geopolitical debates and issue, it really comes home in the price of agricultural commodities.
So, Guy, boiling it all down, the coarse grains market outlook vis-a-vis the U.S. grower, the U.S. seller, again, competition will be keen, but can success be had?
Yeah, well, look, it's going to be a struggle, and I like to give this presentation on the long-term commodity cycle. And where we're at in the commodity cycle is we're back to growing, increasing world global stocks, increasing underlying price support programs and subsidies in that. A lot of upside to coarse grain situation is going to be a challenge. The markets are going to continue in their carry structure, but there will be opportunities to put our commodities into places where it's needed. And one of the broadest outlooks, I'll say, is animal agriculture sector and the production of meat, and that's something the U.S. does very, very well, whether it's beef cattle, like here in Kansas, pork or poultry, and that whole value-added process feeds into the coarse grain sector, and we can compete in that. It also stimulates the whole ag sector here in the U.S., and so I've got to remain very optimistic in production agriculture. It's just we've got to look at the whole supply chain and the whole industry.
We're glad to have you here at Kansas State as part of the IGP Institute, Guy, and looking at these things from that macro view. And we hope to have you back again soon to talk more about what's shaking in the world grain trade. Thanks for coming along and being with us right here today.
Thank you, Eric.
He is Guy Allen, once again the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. And Guy's been our guest on this opening part of Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today and for our latest installment of FSA Coffee Talk as we visit with personnel from the Farm Service Agency, state headquarters for Kansas. And in the guest chair this time around is Program Specialist with the Kansas FSA, Todd Barrows. Todd, glad to have you by today, and we'll get into several timely things concerning the coronavirus assistance. But this has been an interesting time in general for FSA, keeping up with different developments.
Man, it has been, Eric. This has been unprecedented for us in FSA and my career anyway, of what we've seen throughout our state and nation and the different programs and dealing with multiple programs going on simultaneous for our county offices and our field office staff. And I just want to give them a shout out. They're doing a phenomenal job trying to get the word out and the benefits out to the producers. While our offices are open, they're at varying degrees of accessibility across the state with the pandemic, but know that our staff is there and our staff are working to process these applications, these enrollments, and making these payments. Today, I really wanted to focus on the coronavirus food assistance program, or commonly called CFAP. As you know, enrollment for CFAP started on May the 26th, so we're 3 weeks into the program, and Kansas has enrolled just shy of 12,000 livestock producers and 8,300 non-specialty crop growers into the program already, which is just phenomenal. So to say the least, our offices have been busy, and we rank 4th nationally right now as far as the state and the number of applications that we've taken.
Business has been perking, that's for sure. On that CFAP program, who qualifies for it?
Well, one of the biggest questions is that we continue to receive, even though we're going into the 4th week of it, is why the crops or why the commodities that were selected and why not others. And so I just wanted to touch base with the listeners and put out there, CFAP was a program that was written to aid eligible producers for loss of revenue due to effects of the coronavirus pandemic or COVID-19 and what that had on the marketplace. In many instances, producers were unable to sell their commodities, whether that be grain or livestock, because processors had reduced processing production or even had shut down completely during that pandemic scare. And so that did have a direct effect on those producers and being able to market their commodities or their crops. Commodities eligible for CFAP payment were designated based on a 5% or greater market price decline between the weeks of January 13th through the 17th and April 6th through the 10th of 2020.
And so that included which commodities, to spell that out specifically?
Yeah, it includes, that we use the term non-specialty crops, but more commonly that is like your corn, your grain sorghum, soybeans, sorghum forage, sunflowers, your upland cotton. A few of the smaller crops are not as popular, but millet and oats. Also includes wool, and then it includes livestock production, including beef cattle, hogs, and then lambs and yearlings. And then plus there's numerous specialty crops, and when you're talking about specialty crops, you're into your vegetable crops, and then dairy and value loss crops. The producer has to have an eligibility or a risk in producing that crop. They had to have a risk in actually the production of the crop, and so you have to have that to begin with. Then once you establish risk in production of the crop, then you get into whether or not you had inventory of commodity that was subject to the price risk affected by the pandemic on January the 15th, or if you had inventory on, such as livestock, between April the 16th and May the 14th.
Well, what then about the mechanics of applying for this assistance then? There are, of course, forms to fill out and such, but what are the bare-bone details there?
Eric, this is one of the simplest programs as far as filling out and applying for benefits that we've ever administered, and that is it's 100% certification, and it's 100% certification by the producer. There's a form, it's called an AD 3114. The producer fills out the different sections that are applicable to their farming operation, and then they just submit that to their local FSA office. And the FSA office, they look at it as far as doing a reasonableness check. But other than that, that's all they provide is that 3114 form. Yeah, then we'll process it and the payments. Now there is some eligibility requirements, but the basis of the application is just a self-certification.
So not only is the application process rather straightforward, but the actual payment process is expedited pretty well, you say?
Yeah, it sure is. When we talk about payments, the question that a lot of times comes up, how much am I going to get paid right away or up front? And is that going to be 100% of what I'm eligible for? And while that is a great question, actually producers will only receive 80% of their calculated payment up front. And then based on the amount of funding that's available at the end of sign-up, they will pay that additional 20% or a portion thereof if it needs to be factored out. But they will receive 80% up front and then the 20% in the rear depending on availability of funding. Now, one thing I want to point out is, because this is a little bit tricky for CFAP, is that while there's a payment limitation of $250,000 per producer or individual entity for this program, they take in that 80% is factored onto that payment limitation. So, in fact, 80% of the $250,000, really what a producer will receive up front is no more than $200,000.
In a practical sense, then.
Yes.
So, important footnote there. Now, beyond the standard framework of the program, Todd, what sorts of frequent questions are you and, more importantly, your associates out at the county levels receiving about these programs?
Yeah, and I'm just going to highlight on a few, Eric, but some of them, when we're talking about non-specialty crops, and again, we're talking about those corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum, of course, these are production crops. Commonly, you think about grain, but I wanted to mention that they're also eligible if the intended use, if they was taken for harvest as silage, maybe earlage, and then also forage. And what we will do is we'll take that tons of silage that was harvested or forage, and we'll convert that back to a bushels basis for payment under the CFAP program. So even though they were cut for a different intended use, we can still convert them back to a grain basis. Also, out in the western part of the state, they harvest a lot of high moisture corn. So obviously we're not going to pay on that moisture, that water. We're going to shrink that back to a dry weight basis for a U.S. number 2 grading standard. So when producers certify their corn bushels, if it was high moisture, they want to make sure they shrink that back to more of a dry weight basis. We get a lot of times we get the question, and it seems rather obvious, but the question is I sold my grain on January the 15th. Am I eligible? Yeah. And as a matter of fact, you are eligible as long as you had price risk at some point in time during that 24-hour period of January 15th, then you are eligible. So, you can, even if you sold on January the 15th. And then another common question is, I sold my grain at harvest. I bought back the bushels on the Board of Trade. Am I eligible for this program? And unfortunately, you're not eligible because the production that you produced on your farm, you sold. Mm-hmm. Those bushels you bought back on the Board of Trade, you didn't have a risk in producing those bushels. You didn't raise them, so you're not eligible. Now, for livestock producers, the big question I get is on unweaned cow-calf pair operation. I just want to point out that if you haven't heard, a cow-calf pair unweaned, that's 2 animals. You get one payment for that mature cow, and you get a separate payment for a feeder calf less than 600 pounds. As far as dealing with slaughter cattle, it's a little bit tricky of when price risk is lost because it's common in our feedlots that we're selling fats on the grid, and they go on a show list to establish a pricing. We look at, when was that price established based on that show list window, and that is usually on that 5th day, not necessarily when the cattle are delivered to the packing plant. It's when they come off the show list and price has been established.
It's clear that interpretation of eligibility is vital to working one's way through the process of applying for this. And your folks out at the local level, as well as the state staff, have been very good to provide that interpretation. Producers need to consult with those local folks in particular. They've still time to do so, for the deadline for applying for CFAP is still something in the distance.
Yeah, the deadline for CFAP is August the 28th of 2020, so we do still have some time. And as I stated, Eric, can't stress enough, even though this is 100% self-certification by the producer, we want to make sure we're doing an accurate certification. So if they have questions of eligibility, sure enough, reach out to that county office, talk to those people, and get your questions answered before submitting that application. Being the most prudent and accurate up front will save heartache in the end.
You bet. Todd, we appreciate you giving us the latest on this program as it's being implemented here in the state. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
He's a program specialist with the Farm Service Agency, State Office for Kansas, Todd Barrows. Here on Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Now to the latest update on Kansas crop progress and conditions from the USDA, posted yesterday afternoon. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies were fairly drawn down. 1% surplus, 46% adequate, but 53% short to very short. Subsoil moisture as of this past weekend, 1% surplus, 58% adequate, and 44% short to very short. The latest condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop as harvest is underway in southern reaches of the state. 45% good to excellent, 34% fair, and 21% poor to very poor. Harvesting is now 9% complete officially. Corn crop condition in Kansas, 54% good to excellent, 37% fair, and 9% poor to very poor. The condition of soybeans in the state, 64% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 4% poor to very poor. And the state of the grain sorghum crop in Kansas then is at 47% good to excellent, 47% fair, and 6% poor to very poor. Range and pasture conditions in the state, 49% good to excellent this week, 36% fair, and 15% poor to very poor, according to the USDA. As for the latest on the corn and soybean crops nationally, we turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey has the latest look at corn emergence.
We see 95% of the U.S. corn emerged on that date. That is ahead of the 5-year average of 92% and significantly ahead of last year's number. Just 74% of the crop had emerged.
He says emergence is slightly delayed in the eastern corn belt.
Now, corn condition took a little bit of a hit during the week ending June 14th.
The percentage of the crop rated good to excellent dropped 4 percentage points to 71%, while 5% was rated very poor to poor, up 1 point from last week.
Outside of the heart of the Corn Belt, we do see some lower numbers in states like North Carolina, 14% very poor to poor. It has been wet there. And Texas, where drought's an issue, 11% of the corn rated very poor to poor.
Soybean planting is nearing completion.
93% complete nationally. That is ahead of the 5-year soybean planting average of 88% for June 14th and well ahead of last year's 72%.
Rippey says the state with the slowest planting progress is Missouri.
But because a lot of the soybeans there go in after the winter wheat comes out, that's not unusual to see Missouri lagging the overall pace of many of the other states in the Midwest.
For soybean emergence,
it was a pretty warm week, especially in the western Corn Belt, and that promoted a fairly rapid pace of crop development. So we now see 81% of the soybeans emerged, well ahead of the 5-year average of 75%, and way ahead of last year's 49% on this date.
Meanwhile, condition is steady at 72% good to excellent and 4% very poor to poor, unchanged from last week. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And the winter wheat harvest nationally picked up speed this past week, reaching 15% completion as of Sunday. The overall winter wheat condition is at 50% good to excellent for the nation, down 1% from the previous week, with the Oklahoma wheat rating at 46% good to excellent, Texas at 34%. The states with the highest poor ratings included Colorado at 38%, again Kansas at 21%, and Oklahoma at 25%, according to this week's report, again from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now it's on to the weekly feature for you dairy producers, Milk Lines, with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the volatility that we've been experiencing in milk prices and maybe some suggestions as to what we might be able to do to level that out as producers. I think many of the things that we need to look at is what we can do to protect ourselves from these types of drops. And we do have some federal programs that will do that. And I encourage dairy farmers to take a look at those programs, and I encourage them to try to understand where they're at in their current operation and what do they need in terms of protection. Essentially, you're buying an insurance policy. So our dairy margin coverage program allows us exactly to do that, to try to buy some coverage against sudden drops in the milk prices. And it's based on levels of production that we have within our herd or how much we're actually shipping off the farm. And there are some limitations depending on size of farms and those sorts of things as to what we might be able to afford or buy in that program. But if you're in a tight margin situation, it's really important for you to protect yourself. That would be one way to do it. There's some other things that you might want to consider too. Many of our farmers participate in futures markets. And they usually do that on both the milk side and the feed side. The thing I want you to recognize is that if you're going to go this route, this is something that probably requires at least weekly, if not almost daily, contact with what's going on. So as a dairy farmer, you're very busy and you've got a lot of other things going on the dairy. So it might be important for you to work with a risk management group that keeps an eye on the day-to-day things and then maybe speaks with you once a week as to what they're seeing more often when there's volatility that may impact your positions in the market so you can make the necessary moves to continue to protect yourself against sudden changes in both the milk side and the feed side. The challenging thing on the milk side is that trying to predict our basis in that because of our differential the way we price milk. We price some milk in Class 1 and other milk in other classes, Class 3 and 4 in particular, and those contracts on the futures markets end in different months. So it is a bit complicated, so working with a professional might be important to do that. The other thing I guess I would encourage is you need to know your cost. You need to know what your margin need is, and the only way you can know that is if you know your cost of production. Keep in mind all of these processes that we use to try to protect our margin is not necessarily in an effort to guarantee the highest price. It's trying to guarantee the margin that we need to operate our business, and that's going to be different in different settings and different situations. So it's not necessarily one size fits all. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider how they might better protect their margin in the future by using a marketing expert to help them with futures markets and also considering our dairy margin coverage programs that are available.
Thanks for the input, Mike, as always, and we'll return with K-State's Charlie Lee next on Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Next up on Agriculture Today, our weekly stint on wildlife management. Along with us is Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, over the years, we've talked of various approaches to controlling aquatic plants in farm ponds and other water impoundments. And there's an idea out there that's gaining some traction, you say, introducing tilapia to those ponds. More on that specifically in a moment. Tell us about tilapia and their biological story.
Well, tilapia is a very popular fish. It's a fish that's been cultivated for many, many years. They have a tremendous aquaculture potential with almost a worldwide distribution within the last 50 years. They're the second largest food fish industry in the world, but also they're a very popular forage fish in bass and bluegill ponds because they can reproduce heavily. They efficiently use natural aquatic foods. They can aggressively consume pelleted feed, and they tolerate a wide range of water quality conditions. There are three main species of tilapia. The Nile tilapia would be a species that would probably be more common than some of the others and seem to be the species that most of the work has been done on their feeding on algae. Tilapia are shaped somewhat like sunfish or crappie, but they can easily be identified by an interrupted lateral line. They are compressed, very deep bodies with long dorsal fins. The dorsal fin has a heavy spine on it, and the spines are also found on the pelvis and anal fins. The species have various bars, vertical bars on their body, and are found in warm water conditions. One of the problems with tilapia is that since they're native to tropical habitats, they die when the water temperature drops below 50 to 52 degrees for several days. That reduces their suitability for some of the production, as well as their use as a biological control for algae.
So they do have their strengths and their limitations, but they can ingest a significant volume of aquatic plants, and specifically algae, which really makes them attractive, you say.
Yeah, they efficiently use plankton in ponds as well as pelleted feed, so the growth and reproduction can be directly increased by fertilizing or supplementally feeding. They respond well to feeding schedules that are similar to what's been developed and researched for bluegill. They seem to work well in ponds that include both largemouth bass and bluegill. But the main push, I think, for tilapia is their use as aquatic plant control. Probably one of the safest, surest ways to get rid of unhealthy blue-green algae, or chara, or the unsightly filamentous algae that many people call pond scum or moss. They have some benefits in controlling duckweed, watermeal. Those are all aquatic plants that many people struggle with trying to figure out how to control them. They're very effective at eating planktonic algae. I think this is a technique that is probably going to surpass the use of grass carp, which many people are familiar with. Grass carp do a good job of feeding on soft vascular plants, but are not very good at consuming algae. Tilapia kind of work the other way. They do a good job of feeding on algae, and several species do not consume vascular plants.
So is anything known about, for example, stocking rates of tilapia for the purposes of doing away with aquatic vegetation?
Well, that's one of the areas where perhaps the research is not caught up. There's a lot of variables that influence the number and size of the fish that would be stocked. If your pond is already stocked with game fish, that includes predator fish, they recommend stocking blue tilapia at about 60 pounds per acre for algae control, as well as providing that forage for your game fish. There have been several commercial companies that are selling blue tilapia, and I've seen recommendations as low as 15 to 20 pounds an acre all the way up to 100 pounds an acre. I think it really depends upon the amount of weeds that you have in your pond, the volume of those weeds, and the size of the predator fish. Tilapia are going to reproduce or can reproduce maybe 3 to 4 times during the summer. And so they're going to be producing a lot of small fish that are going to be consuming algae and other phytoplankton. But if you have a lot of largemouth bass in the pond that are large in size, you're going to have to stock much larger tilapia to get them to survive long enough to start consuming the algae. They're really not a species that feeds on the algae. They have a very thick mucus that's on their gills, and as they swim through the pond, that is collected and then swallowed as a bolus. So they can actually be collecting that algae and do a good job of clearing up the water clarity in many ponds.
So they may be at least a partial answer to such formidable problems as blue-green algae development, but there is that caveat. They can't stand cold water, therefore they have to be reintroduced each spring?
Yes, they would have to be restocked each spring. Probably around May 1st is when water temperatures would be warm enough that tilapia would start to survive. Remember, the cooler water, the more sluggish the tilapia would be. When they're sluggish in the spring, they're easier prey for largemouth bass. So largemouth bass are hungry at that time of the year. And if you put them in with the water too cool in the spring, they're just going to be fairly expensive minnows that you're feeding your largemouth bass. I think the true value is going to be, once we figure out the right stocking rate, their value will be in ridding ponds of blue-green algae that has the potential to turn toxic.
Once again, they're being examined very closely for their ability to clean up farm ponds and do away with unwanted vegetation, including blue-green algae. Tilapia. And Charlie, we appreciate the word on this today. K-State Research and Extension Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee with us. And our time is once again away for today. Our thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.